American historians, greetings. APUSH Review, Unit 14, World War II. Social dislocations resulting from wartime conditions frequently bring lasting change within a society. Evaluate the relevance of this generalization to American society in the 20th century. Well, if we are talking about blacks, World War I brought a return um, to Jim Crow when the war is over with. There is not the change that many blacks hoped, and there are the 1919 race riots. World War II, you have the Presidential Executive Order 8802 that banned discrimination in wartime industries. This kept A. Philip Randolph from organizing a protest march in D.C. during the middle of the war. Also, blacks flew in the Air Force. You have the Tuskegee Airmen, but there was still segregation in the military with black units led by white officers. During the Korean War, Truman issued an executive order integrating the armed forces. Because of U.S. wars against non-democratic totalitarianism, there was support for the civil rights movement, which gained momentum in the 1950s. As far as women go, World War I and World War II saw women take the jobs of men who went off to combat. World War II, you had that iconic image of Rosie the Riveter. Women had gained the right to vote in 1920. They de facto got extended economic power during World War II, and this increased freedom led to the demand for greater social and sexual freedom in the 1960s. But it can be argued that the 1950s was also a period of conformity, as most women stayed home, had kids, thus beginning the baby boom. Question 2 here is, why did we drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima? This was a DBQ a number of years ago on an AP U.S. history test. And if you argue there's military reasons to drop the bomb, you can point out that it saved American lives. The casualty toll was staggering preceding the dropping of the atomic bomb, taking these little islands like Tarawa, Saipan, Okinawa, Iwo Jima. The planned invasion of Japan might have had hundreds of thousands of U.S. casualties. It could also be argued that ultimately the dropping of the A-bomb saved Japanese lives. There was dying of starvation, of hunger because of bombing that had disrupted internal rail transport of food. Also, many Japanese were dying in aerial bombing of Japanese cities. And conventional bombing, especially with incendiary bombs, was killing numbers in Tokyo, the equivalent of those killed in either Nagasaki or Hiroshima. Political reasons to drop the bomb. The USSR had promised to fight the Japanese, and after Germany was defeated, and the U.S. did not want this anymore. It's been argued that dropping the bomb was a political statement as well as a military necessity. The Soviets were occupying Eastern Europe and interfering with free elections. The U.S. feared the spread of communism. Question 3, Americans had been idealists going to war, but realists at the peace table. Assess the validity of the statement for any two of the following. Well, the Revolutionary War, the U.S. got more than they expected, with England agreeing to surrender all land to the Mississippi River and to allow fishing rights off the coast of Canada. Ideally, the war was over freedom for the 13 colonies, but realistically, the Americans sought and won very favorable western boundaries. B, the Mexican War. Ideally, this is a war for holding our ground at the Texan border. Realistically, this war is one of conquest and territorial expansion in the service of Southern slavery, which the U.S. achieved through the Mexican surrender of the Southwest and the Mexican cession. C, the First World War. The U.S. idealistically is fighting to make the world safe for democracy, but realistically, Wilson fails at the peace table to keep England and France and Italy from punishing Germany in the very unkind Versailles Treaty. Wilson does win the League of Nations, a very idealistic attempt to prevent future wars, but the U.S. Senate does not ratify it. Idealistically, the U.S. followed a policy of isolationism for the rest of the 1920s and into the early 1930s. Idealistically keeping us out of war, realistically bowing to American disgust at the results of the war. Question D, the Second World War, the U.S. idealistically tried to stay out of the war by passing strict neutrality acts, but later the U.S. reluctantly tried to help England and Russia without actually going to war ourselves, and that would be in things like the destroyer for bases, Lend-Lease, cash and carry. After Pearl Harbor, Hitler declared war on the U.S. We went to war with Japan and Germany. which we had wanted to avoid before December 17, 1941. After World War II, the U.S. realistically tried to follow a policy of not punishing Germany, but by rebuilding it via the Marshall Plan, tying it defensively to NATO, and quickly uniting the Allied zones into West Germany. And this is all a recognition that the punishment that Germany received at the end of World War I just led to grievances and resentment and ultimately revenge. Also, after World War II, the U.S. was not isolationist anymore. We're sort of the indispensable nation. And realistically, we create NATO, we issue the Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine, and we organize the Berlin Airlift. Compare the motives and methods of silencing dissent. We've done this one before. Remember the Alien and Sedition Acts during that quasi-naval war with the French. Adams will issue these Alien and Sedition Acts, which are challenged by the Virginia-Kentucky resolutions. Adams will be defeated in the 1800 election by Thomas Jefferson. The Civil War sees the suspension of habeas corpus, especially in Maryland. The border states do not secede. So you could argue that the Habeas Corpus Act is successful, especially considering that Washington, D.C. is surrounded by two slave states, Maryland and Virginia. World War I, the Sedition and Espionage Acts punished socialists for interfering with military recruiting. In World War II, fear of sabotage led FDR to issue an executive order putting Japanese Americans into concentration camps. 5. The Constitution authorizes Congress to declare war, but America has more often become involved in war as a result of presidential action. Look at James Madison or James K. Polk and William McKinley or Franklin D. Roosevelt. So you had 4 presidents, pick 2 of them. James Monroe, like Washington, Adams, and correction here, James Madison, not James Monroe. James Madison, like Washington, Adams, and Jefferson, tried to be neutral, but British actions forced the American hands, and we were forced into war, basically because of impressment, maybe to a lesser extent, the Warhawks desiring to seize Canada. James K. Polk invaded Mexico, provoked Mexico into war, and he earlier threatened war against England over Oregon. William McKinley, the U.S. Maine, was sent to Havana to intimidate Spain, and our pro-rebel stance was not neutral at all. The U.S. Yellow Press whipped up anti-Spanish sentiment, and the U.S. Navy had been sent towards the Philippines in anticipation of a breakout of hostilities, and we grabbed the Philippines, and we also took Guam in the Pacific, and we took Puerto Rico in the Caribbean, although our only specific complaint is over the treatment of the Cubans. We do become an imperialist power when the war is said and done. You could throw in here that the Emiliano Aguinaldo's rebellion against the American occupation of the Philippines is brutally suppressed by the American army. It's been argued up to 100,000 Filipinos will die of things like being put in concentration camps and being shot at, and malnutrition and disease because of this American warfare against the British, or what am I saying here, against the Filipino rebels. And FDR arguably put us into a course that led to war. We're going to get the draft under him. We're going to get the occupation of Greenland and Iceland all before any fighting breaks out. We are going to be patrolling the North Atlantic, and we are going to be shipping equipment and supplies and giving loans to the Brits and Russians under destroyer for bases for cash and carry, and then Lend-Lease. So you could argue that we are not at all neutral, and we're also cutting off trade and embargoing goods like oil and machine tools and scrap metal to the Japanese. Regarding Japan, the Stimson Doctrine, this is points showing of lack of neutrality. The Stimson Doctrine said the U.S. would not recognize territory taken by force. This is aimed at the Japanese 1931 seizure of northern China, which is Manchuria. And again, the U.S. did embargo in 1940 scrap metal, machine tools, aviation fuel. And in 1941, the U.S. embargoed oil and froze Japanese bank deposits. In Germany, the Neutrality Acts forbade the selling or making loans to nations at war, the traveling on their ships, if the nations were at war, and selling to parties in a civil war. 1937, Congress allowed the sale of goods on a cash and carry basis. In other words, no credit, and not on our ships. We didn't want, we didn't want it to, our ships to be getting us into war like in 1917 and World War I. 1939, the Embargo Acts were repealed. 1940, you have conscription. 1940, you have destroyer for bases deal with the Brits. 1941, you have the Lend-Lease Act for Britain and Russia and to China, although much less goods went to China. 1941, the Atlantic Charter, the U.S. and Great Britain agreed on war aims, and this is all before we are even at war. And the Atlantic Charter essentially says that this is not a war of aggrandizement. This is not a war of aggression on our part. 1941, the Reuben James, a U.S. destroyer, was sunk, and the U.S. okayed the arming of merchant ships. This is all while we're technically neutral against the Germans. And again, we occupy Greenland and Iceland. Flip the page here, question 6. To what extent did the U.S. adopt an isolationist policy in the 1920s and 30s? Let's just go back a little farther to the 20s. We won't rehash the 30s. The U.S. Senate rejected the Versailles Treaty because of the League of Nations. And 1924, the National Origin Act limited immigration. We didn't want anything to do with these Southern, Central, and Eastern Europeans. We basically turned the tap off. Point 3, 1921 through 22, the Washington Naval Conference gave us the Four-Power Treaty, where we agreed to respect each other's colonies in the Pacific. The Five-Power Treaty agreed to reduce naval tonnage. The idea here is an arms reduction will lessen the chance for future wars. And the Nine-Power Treaty agreed essentially for an open door in China to respect each other's trade rights in China. The Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928 banned the use of war to settle international disputes. And again, the 1930s saw these series of neutrality acts trying to keep us out of war as Spain burst into civil war and as war does break out between Germany and most of the surrounding countries. Question 6. You know what? Your book, the review book, at least the one I'm looking at, repeats question 6, and the first time I had it on the first page here, I don't have what's on the bottom of the next page, if that makes any sense, but what's on the next page was on the previous page here, so hopefully just look, what's on the second question 6 is all answered under question 5. Okay, that should make sense if you're looking at the review book. And finally, 2 more questions. Question 7, analyze the home front experiences of 2 of the following groups during the Second World War: African Americans, Japanese Americans, Jewish Americans, or Mexican Americans. This was originally a 35-minute question on the old AP exam. For African Americans, kind of bullet pointed here, you could talk about general Jim Crow discrimination against black Americans in the United States. You can talk about the Great Migration, where millions of blacks are moving in the 20s and 30s, and especially the 40s. They're moving north from rural areas in the South to cities, and they're taking defense jobs in the North and on the West Coast. Over 1 million blacks will join the armed services, or about 10% of the U.S. military. They're allowed into the Air Force for the first time. The Tuskegee Airmen are these famous flyers. And blacks are allowed into the Marines. There's continued segregation in the military, though. A. Philip Randolph and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters will threaten a protest march leading to the 1941 Executive Order 8802, which says there will be no discrimination in hiring and pay in the war industry for black Americans. Excuse me. There are riots in various cities over housing shortages. There's white resentment against many of these blacks that are moving to places like Detroit and Chicago and New York. Jesse Owens, before the war in 1936, embarrassed Hitler by winning a bunch of medals in the Berlin Olympics. As far as Japanese Americans, racism against Japanese Americans did precede Pearl Harbor. Refer back to the Gentleman's Agreement here under Teddy Roosevelt. There were relocation centers / internment camps. Some people call them concentration camps. Keep in mind, Japanese were not tortured and they were not killed in these camps, but they were imprisoned, 110,000 of them, behind barbed wire as potential security threats, without trial, without accusation, without any due process. Some terms here. Issei refer to first-generation Japanese in America. Nisei are the second-generation American-born Japanese, and Sensei are the third generation. And about 40,000 of those in the camps were Issei, and about 70,000 were Nisei and Sansei. and that 2/3 approximately, these are Japanese Americans who had no other experience than being Americans. Property of these relocated Japanese Americans had to be sold at a loss. The 22nd Regimental Combat Team of Japanese recruits did fight bravely in Italy, very heavily decorated. Korematsu versus the U.S. upheld the internment of Japanese Americans, although 1944 Ex parte Endo ruled that loyal citizens could not be imprisoned, but did not address the issue of whether Japanese Americans were loyal or not. So you have these two competing Supreme Court cases. Jewish Americans, anti-Semitism existed in the U.S. Charles Lindbergh, Father Coughlin, Henry Ford, all very publicly anti-Semitic. Many Jews were limited where they could live as far as neighborhoods, limited for college admissions. The U.S. State Department turned away many refugees. Keep in mind, 1930s is the Great Depression. Americans aren't looking for unemployed foreigners. Physicists Albert Einstein, Enrico Fermi, Edward Teller entered the U.S. They're all instrumental in our development of an atomic weapon during the Manhattan Project. Approximately 500,000 Jews served in the military. I'm just making a note here. Jews served in the military. 500,000, it has to be a number that's too high. I think what I meant was 50,000. Double check that one before you repeat it. Sorry about that. But Jews do serve in the military. The U.S. policy was not to bomb Nazi death camps. The thinking here is that these very risky bombing missions need to be in support of American troops on the ground, that if American troops can bring the war to an end, that this is the ultimate thing that will end the killing of Jews. There's a lot of sort of after-the-fact argument that, we should have bombed the death camps, we should have bombed the railways into them. The fact is we didn't for whatever the reason. Whether it was a good reason or not, we didn't bomb the death camps or the avenues into them. Jews protested against the silence on extermination, and they advocated for post-war refugee assistance. Mexican Americans faced discrimination and prejudice in the United States during this time period. The Bracero farm laborers were allowed to work California farms and in other states. We did allow Mexicans to come and do work in the fields in the Southwest. Approximately 300,000 Mexican Americans do serve in the military. I shouldn't say that's to be Hispanic Americans, probably at this time mostly Mexican Americans. Summer of 1943 of the Zoot Suit riots in L.A., where sailors attacked Mexican American teenagers who were wearing these kind of baggy zoot suits. And there was plentiful work for Mexican Americans in defense industries. You often don't think of Mexican Americans moving to the north and the Midwest, but many did, and they moved for the same reason blacks are moving from the south, for good pay, good jobs in the booming factories and the defense industries in the north. Last question, 8. How and for what reasons did the U.S. foreign policy change between 1920 and 1941? Well, after World War I, the U.S. retreated into a policy of isolationism. The U.S. refused to sign the Versailles Treaty or join the League of Nations. The Washington Naval Conferences saw a reduction of naval ships. The Kellogg-Briand Pact naively outlawed war as an instrument of foreign policy. FDR promised a good neighbor policy toward Latin America, which found its test when Mexico nationalized U.S. oil wells and FDR refused to intervene. Finally, U.S. tariffs reached an all-time high with the Smoot-Hawley Tariff of 1930. The Nye Senate Committee suggested wartime profiteering had occurred during World War I. After Japan's 1931 invasion of Manchuria, the U.S. Stimson Doctrine said that we would recognize no military takeovers of land by any nation. But with the rise of Mussolini and Hitler, the U.S. passed several restrictive neutrality acts, banning sales and loans to nations at war, and banned travel on their ships. This neutrality was extended towards Spain during its 1936 to 1939 Civil War. The U.S. modified its neutrality under cash and carry. In 1939, after Hitler overran most of Europe, the U.S. swapped 40 destroyers for 6 British bases in the Americas. In 1941, FDR adopted the Lend-Lease plan for Britain and for the Soviet Union. The U.S. aided Britain in patrolling the North Atlantic for German subs. The U.S. also occupied Greenland and Iceland, all before war was declared against any of the Axis powers. The U.S. prior to Pearl Harbor also slowly tightened an embargo against Japan on scrap metal, aviation fuel, and then all oil, ending with a freeze on Japanese assets and bank accounts in the U.S., and this, of course, is before December 7, 1941, when Pearl Harbor is attacked. So the AP doesn't ask a lot of questions on the military details of World War II. Basically, what led to World War II, how things changed from previous isolationist policy, and then they'll ask you questions comparing the treatment of Germany after the war, American involvement in European affairs with American involvement in Europe after World War I. So we go from being isolationist to becoming that indispensable nation. We become to being very interventionist. We organize this alliance system with NATO. So diplomacy, foreign policy before and after the war, you should know, and definitely how the war affects the United States economically and how it affects minority groups during the war. That would be blacks and women and Hispanics and Asian Americans, namely the Japanese Americans. All right, study hard, stiff upper lip, and carry on.